In an unexpected trend that seems to have picked up tremendously since September this year, Gen Z-led protests have seemingly swept across the globe. The most significant this month comes from the island nation of Madagascar, which, as we all know, was created following the success of the 2005 DreamWorks movie of the same name. The movement initially began in the middle of September, when small protests were organized to denounce the nation's frequent power outages, water cuts, and general government corruption. Much like the protests we covered last month in France, Indonesia, and Nepal, the one-piece Jolly Roger with a regionally relevant hat quickly became the symbol of the movement. On the 24th of September, the government would ban protests in the capital of Antananarivo, stating that they could lead to unrest. Anyway, the next day saw thousands take to the streets of Antananarivo, which would quickly fall into a state of unrest. Protesters would be met with heavy police resistance, who would go on to employ rubber bullets and tear gas. By the end of the day, looters would raid local retail stores, the homes of several House senators would be set on fire, and 5 people would be left dead after being shot by AK-47s. It should be noted that André Rajoelina, who was both the president of Madagascar and the youngest-looking 51-year-old in the world, was not in the country at the outbreak of these protests. Instead, he was attending the UN General Assembly in New York. President Rajoelina has faced stiff criticism leading up to the protests, notably for a $152 million investment into a 13-kilometer cable car, which was widely criticized as unnecessary. When the protests are based around people not having water or electricity, you can see why citizens might become pissed off at where the tax dollars are going. President Rajoelina's personal wealth has also been a source of resentment, with his daughter being seen with designer brands, and his son attending the elite EHL Lausanne Hospitality School in Switzerland. Our findings estimate that 4 years of tuition would cost roughly $200,000. Considering this would take the average Malagasy citizen over 60 years to earn that much money, it's not surprising why the president has become particularly unpopular. By the 13th of October, the elite CAPSAT unit of the nation's armed forces announced that it had taken control of all military forces, and on the 14th, it had seized control of the government. President Rajoelina, who had already been impeached by a near unanimous vote, was assumed to have fled the country. As with all government overthrows backed by the military, this was the defining moment which separates the successful from the unsuccessful. In a successful overthrow, the military will immediately cede power to a temporary interim government, who would commit to a short stint in power before official elections can be held. Such examples include the appointments of Muhammad Yunus acting as chief advisor of Bangladesh following the 2024 ousting of Sheikh Hasina, and September's appointment of Sushila Karki as the interim prime minister of Nepal. Ideally, leaders should be highly competent and respected, set a clear timeline for elections to take place, and, most importantly, really not want to be there. Unfortunately, these transitions of power usually rely on the military to either stand down or join the protesters in pushing out the current government. At this key moment, however, there's not much actually stopping the military from taking control themselves, which is what happened in Madagascar. Although initially stating that a civilian government would be quickly assembled following the ousting of President Rajoelina, Colonel Mikhail Randrianarina would state that the nation would be ruled by a military leader for up to 2 years. In the meantime, the military would form a council made up of military officers and members of law enforcement. Only a few days later, Colonel Randrianarina would be sworn in as the nation's president. Both the African Union and the United Nations would condemn the military takeover, and these political stains will make it much harder for the nation to participate in regional decision-making and cooperate with global partners. Quite ironically, President Rajoelina was first appointed president in 2009 following another coup that was also spearheaded by the army, and sparked by very similar grievances. Perhaps even funnier is that Colonel Randrianarina was already arrested less than 2 years ago for trying to coup President Rajoelina. It gets even sillier, because once he was charged, brought before the court, and sent to prison all on the same day, he would later be released and return to his post a few months later. They really released Cooey McGee and expected him not to conduct another coup. We currently don't know how this military-led government intends to address the concerns of the protest movement, or whether it truly intends to cede power within 2 years. Madagascar's ousting of President Rajoelina marks the 4th time in just over a year that a Gen Z-led protest has caused a change in government, or the 5th time if you count the impeachment of Peru's president 2 days earlier, which we'll cover soon enough. However, as this situation demonstrates, the tricky part isn't removing the current government, it's actually replacing it with something better. Madagascar and Peru now join the ranks of Bangladesh, Mongolia, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, who have all come under a broad movement of Gen Z protests. Some have taken to calling it the Asian Spring, a reference to the Arab Spring in the early 2010s, a pro-democratic movement which spread to 16 nations in the Middle East and North Africa. The Asian Spring, at least so far, has proved to be far more successful, and despite a number of injuries and deaths, has been significantly less violent. It should be noted that these are just the nations that have, at the very least, seen a change of leadership following protests. Other countries, such as the Philippines, Paraguay, Maldives, Indonesia, and Morocco, are, as of time of writing, experiencing similar protest movements, with their ranks largely made up of young people. As for why such protests seem to be absent within regions such as the Middle East or the Western world, this largely comes under the unique circumstances that spark them. Most of these nations tend to skew relatively young demographically, and have grievances usually related to corruption, economic pressures, and wealth inequality. The nature of government in power also plays a big role. Governments being overthrown are usually semi-authoritarian. This means that they're still susceptible to the kind of decentralized, leaderless movements that these Gen Z protests tend to embody. By comparison, governments within the Middle East tend to be more authoritarian, and willing to use much more violence to crack down on such movements. Alternatively, although people within Western nations face economic inequality and cost of living concerns, people still feel empowered to make change through voting and more peaceful forms of demonstration. Gen Z in Western nations also tend to be demographically smaller and more politically fragmented, making such movements less likely to reach critical mass. Whether this weirdly long string of youth-led protests will continue, and whether history will view them as successful, are questions still yet to be determined, but we'll be following these events as they unfold over the coming months. If you're looking to step up your internet privacy, or just want a way around region-locked content, you might be interested in our sponsor, Surfshark VPN. By now, you probably know all about Surfshark's ability to make trackers, malware, and phishing attempts a thing of the past. But you might not be aware of the full scope of Surfshark's Clean Web features. Specifically, Surfshark's Clean Web 2.0 browser extension can disable ads on YouTube. We might otherwise hesitate to tell you that, but news doesn't get monetized, so YouTube played themselves with this one. Surfshark can also let you watch region-locked content. A lot of shows put entire episodes on YouTube for free, so if you know which country to pick, you could be saving yourself some money. To get started, just go to surfshark.com/SirSwag, use the code SirSwag, or scan this QR code, and you'll also score yourself an extra 4 months on the house. The best part is if you're not completely satisfied with Surfshark, you can just back out within the first 30 days and get a full refund. Surfshark VPN, it's cheaper than the other ones. Meanwhile, a comedian criticizes American free speech at a Saudi Arabian comedy show. The US government's 20-point peace plan aims to install Tony Blair as the leader of Gaza, and the US Energy Department adds climate change and green to its list of banned terminology. As we previously mentioned, Peru is another country which has experienced an unexpected leadership shakeup, with the impeachment of Dina Boluarte on the 10th of October. Saying that Boluarte was an unpopular leader would be an understatement of colossal proportions.
She was just a mean, old, hateful bitch.
She was often called the world's least popular leader.
I mean, she'd rip you a brand new 3-bedroom, 2-bath, double-wide asshole. No problem.
And at one point, even issued a decree to double her salary while having an approval rating of just 2%. Boluarte's history of unpopularity goes back long before she became president. In 2021, Boluarte became vice president after the election win of Pedro Castillo. Castillo would eventually be removed from office after attempting to coup himself in 2022, which is a whole story we don't have time to get into. Castillo's removal from office was met with a huge wave of protests that lasted over 3 months. Unlike Pedro Castillo, a former union representative who led a far-left party, Boluarte was seen to be an opportunist who aligned with far-right factions to assume the presidency. This left many of Pedro Castillo's supporters feeling disenfranchised, especially rural and indigenous voters who made up a large part of his base. It also didn't help that the protests were met with intense government crackdowns, with the police and armed forces killing at least 60 people. Notably, a report by Amnesty International found 6 documented cases of children being executed. Needless to say, Boluarte's government abandoning her base, suspending constitutional rights, and executing children didn't leave a good impression of her first few months in office. As inane as it sounds, she would only become less popular from there. In 2023, Boluarte would take a 2-week break from office to undergo plastic surgery on her nose. She also claimed the surgery was undertaken due to breathing problems, but never actually delegated her powers or informed the public before leaving for the 2-week period. Fast forward to March 2024, and the Public Ministry of Peru opened an investigation for illicit enrichment, after people began noticing that she had been wearing Rolex watches. By reviewing nearly 10,000 images, news site La Encerrona was able to document how her watches became increasingly more expensive as her term went on. When we say free press is critical for the proper functioning of democratic systems, this is the exact type of shit we're talking about. One such Rolex was found to be worth 3 times her monthly salary as president. An investigation would later find that she had received $330,000 over the past 8 years from unidentified accounts. By the time Dina Boluarte was kicked out, protests calling for her removal had already been going for nearly a month. By the time the impeachment took place, not a single member of Congress voted against her removal. But that wasn't the end of the protests, because to those out on the streets, Dina Boluarte was just part of the problem. Peru itself has had a pretty unfortunate string of leaders over the last 30 years. In the 1990s, the nation was governed by Alberto Fujimori, a dictator with a long history of self-enrichment and human rights violations. Next up was President Alejandro Toledo, a man who was sentenced to over 20 years for receiving millions in construction bribes from Brazilian company Odebrecht. Succeeding Toledo is President Alan Garcia, who shot and killed himself after having similar links to Odebrecht construction bribes. Next was President Ollanta Humala, who was sentenced to 15 years in prison for once again receiving campaign contributions from Odebrecht.
I'm beginning to see a pattern here that I'm not so sure if I like.
Following Humala, President Pedro Pablo Kaczynski would step down from office and be placed on house arrest for a money laundering scandal, primarily involving Odebrecht. Fortunately, the president Martin Vizcarra was not involved at all with Odebrecht.
Impossible. Perhaps the archives are incomplete.
But he was impeached following a bribery scandal. We then finally get to Pedro Castillo, the guy who attempted to coup himself. Castillo's presidency was notably characterized by the nation's highest level of inflation in 26 years. To prevent the takeover of Dina Boluarte, Castillo quite famously invoked Article 34 of Peru's constitution. To learn more about how this inflation-led crisis led to the nation's first female president, simply Google Rule 34 Latina inflation. Although Dina Boluarte was removed from office, many protesters believe that Peru's entire elected government has an inability to properly function. It also didn't help that Peru's new president, José Gerri, has been marred in allegations of bribery, illicit enrichment, and sexual assault. As of time of writing, the protests have resulted in 1 death, 17 arrests, and over 100 injuries. We now cross over to the US, and before we jump into the stories that are sad and miserable, let's first jump into the ones that are still sad, but make up for it in comedic value. The month of October saw a prolonged government shutdown, EA being partially acquired by the president's son-in-law, and a very tragic string of mass shootings. We didn't check or research that last part, but, you know. One quite significant headline was the wave of No Kings protests which took place on the 18th of October. The protests, which followed a similar wave earlier in June, are in opposition of President Trump's policies since taking office for a second term. The protests took place over 2,700 locations, and although local organizers placed the attendance at 7 million, an Atlanta-based science newsroom put the median estimate between 5 to 6.5 million. Assuming this is accurate, this would make both No Kings Kings protests the first and second largest in US history. This probably comes as a surprise to a lot of viewers, as even we nearly missed something this big, which is probably down to how weirdly peaceful it was. Despite its enormous scale, we struggled to find any instances of violence, which as a team who spends half their time covering these things is truly an anomaly. The closest thing we could find is a kid beating up a Donald Trump effigy and a stall with the words, "Charlie Kirk had it coming." We usually get to show you guys footage of riot police and Molotovs, but couldn't find jack shit. Our favorite sign from the event was definitely the one of Shadow the Hedgehog holding a bottle of Tylenol with the words, "Come and take it." This is, of course, a reference to US Secretary of Health RFK Jr. recently linking the drug's use during pregnancy to cases of autism. RFK has an extensive history of promoting dubious medical claims, and in this instance, the studies presented didn't actually claim to have proven such a causation. Another banger of a claim from RFK this month was a link between autism and circumcision. However, not to be outdone, the funniest thing we could find was from President Trump himself, who responded to the protests by stating, quote, "They say they're referring to me as a king. I'm not a king." The very next day, however, the president would post an AI video of himself wearing a crown and using a fighter jet to drop enormous payloads of shit on protesters. Discounting all the things we'll get into in a second, this man has been an absolute gift to the news industry. Another fun story was FBI Director Kash Patel giving 3D printed guns to senior security officials in New Zealand. The recipients would then say, "Oh no, we appreciate the thoughtful gift, but that's illegal as, eh?" The firearms were determined to be too hard to render inoperable, and were subsequently destroyed. With this being said, the average New Zealand man sounds like Boba Fett, and can bench a small car, meaning you'd be royally fucked trying to fight one with or without a gun. Just for context, this is a fucking New Zealand high school. Supposedly German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel once said, quote, "Give me the Maori battalion and I will conquer the world." Luckily for us, there are only around 400 people who live in New Zealand, so we're safe for now. In the last part of the goofy silly section of our US coverage, President Trump made the unexpected move of commuting the sentence of former US Representative George Santos. In a country bursting at the seams with weird and wacky political figures, Santos might just be the all-time GOAT. The former representative for New York's 3rd District quite famously lied about nearly all aspects of his life in his autobiography. Notably, Santos lied that he had been a business consultant on Wall Street, graduated from the Barak College, and another weirdly specific claim that he was a standout player on its volleyball team. A favorite lie of ours was a false claim that he was Jewish. Santos later explained that his mother's family had a Jewish background. What he meant was that he was Jew-ish. We can't even be mad, that's funny as fuck. After being expelled from Congress in 2023, Santos began selling personalized videos on Cameo, resurrected his drag queen persona, and started an account on OnlyFans. He would also be nominated for the Best Streamer Collaboration at the 2024 Streamer Awards when he played Fortnite with YouTuber Connor Eats Pants. In August 2024, Santos pleaded guilty to identity theft and wire fraud, ultimately being sentenced to 87 months in prison. As to why President Trump commuted his sentence this month, he would explain in his own words, quote, "George Santos was somewhat of a rogue, but there are many rogues throughout our country that aren't forced to serve 7 years in prison." Now that we've gotten everyone nice and comfortable with actually enjoying our US coverage, it's time to get to the not so fun parts. Kicking off our less fun coverage, the US government has continued its trend of using Call of Duty kill streaks on narcotics boats in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. From the first strike on the 2nd of September, there have now been 10 separate strikes conducted on suspected narcotics boats, with 8 in the Caribbean and 2 in the Pacific. Despite 43 people having been killed over these 10 strikes, the US government has yet to publish any such evidence. We've had to amend these numbers twice during our writing period, so viewers should keep in mind that it may may be higher by the time you're watching it. Commenting on the strikes, President Trump has stated, quote, "We have the greatest military in the world, we have the greatest weapons in the world." And you see a little bit of it there. One shot, everyone dead center. And the only way you can't feel bad about it is you realize that every time you see it happen, you're saving 25,000 American lives. Of course, legal scholars have tended to argue that these strikes are turbo illegal within international law. When we looked into the numerous comments made by legal experts, the best legal justification we could find was from law professor Gabor Rona. He says that the strikes are still super illegal, but they follow a precedent set by other 9/11 strikes conducted by all previous US administrations since. He would go on to say, quote, "There is a precedent for considering such attacks, when committed on a widespread or systematic basis, to be a crime against humanity." Once again, this was the friendliest legal scholar we could find. In a practical sense, however, such strikes will only stop if the president decides to discontinue them, or the system of checks and balances steps in to legally ask him to stop. Both of these currently remain unlikely. According to recent data obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, roughly 88% of all illegal drugs seized by border and customs agents are brought in through normal ports of entry, with 80% being from US citizens. It should be noted, however, that these are the number of seizures, which doesn't account for the volume of drugs seized or the amount that actually slipped through. We could simply interpret these figures to mean that US citizens are just getting dunked on in the drug smuggling game. We can only assume that they didn't watch our step-by-step guide on how to smuggle drugs. For some reason, Swag still wonders why sponsors find us too risky. The strikes come as a backdrop to the Trump administration supposedly wanting a regime change within Venezuela, with the ultimate goal of ousting President Nicolas Maduro. We've talked about this guy quite a lot going all the way back to 2019, but to say he's a shit leader would certainly be an understatement. Since coming into power in 2013, 20% of Venezuela's population has outright fled the country, owing to severe hyperinflation, rising rates of poverty, and harsh government crackdowns. At one point, it was more profitable for most Venezuelans to gold farm on RuneScape than to work local jobs. It's no secret that President Trump has wanted Maduro removed for a long time, previously backing Juan Guaido in the nation's 2019 elections, and applying many of the sanctions that have since crippled Venezuela's economy. Over the past 2 months, the US has even started a steady buildup of warships along the Venezuelan coast, and long-range B-52s have carried out bomber attack demonstrations off the coast of Venezuela. The message here is, we haven't dropped any bombs, but we could if we wanted to. Earlier in October, the New York Times reported that high-ranking US military officials had begun drafting plans of invasion for President Trump to review, as well as President Trump reportedly giving approval for covert CIA action inside of Venezuela. In response, President Maduro announced that he had deployed thousands of Igla-S Russian anti-air missiles and ordered the mobilization of millions of troops to defensive positions around the country. It should be noted that this is just what Maduro claims and not necessarily what's being carried out. Although the Trump administration might similarly claim that this kind of military posturing is being done all in the name of the war on drugs, this probably isn't the case. Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and Mexico are far better targets for a pure drug war, and the Caribbean isn't a major sea route for smuggling drugs, especially compared to the Pacific Ocean. Alternatively, many military analysts believe that all these US military assets are intended to act as a show of force, and ideally encourage Maduro's inner circle to move against him. Although there's a real humanitarian and democratic case for the US trying to overthrow Maduro, a cynic would be justified to think that this is merely a self-serving move by the US. If we could strip away Venezuela's astronomical levels of corruption and economically crippling sanctions, the nation could theoretically be one of the richest nations on Earth. Venezuela has the largest confirmed oil deposits on the planet, huge reserves of iron and gold, and the 8th largest natural gas reserves globally. It would be optimistic to think that a government overthrow could lead to a world where the Venezuelan people are able to profit from the fruits of their own country, but that probably won't be the case. In a political sense, a US-friendly Venezuelan government might be less inclined to work with its current closest partners, that being Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba. Notably, these are all nations that currently have a less than friendly relationship with the United States. Regardless of what people might claim, we can only hope that the outcome is a net positive for the Venezuelan people, who, considering the last few decades, really fucking deserve a win. Sticking with our America coverage, and the Pentagon has introduced a policy this month which critics have argued restricts freedom of the press. The new rules now bar journalists from entering the Pentagon.
Let me in! Let me in!
Unless they agree to only report information that has been officially authorized by the Department of Defense. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, himself a former Fox News host, tweeted about the change, quote, "Pentagon access is a privilege, not a right," and that credentialized press no longer permitted to solicit criminal acts. It should be noted that even before this change, journalists working within the Pentagon are still limited to the non-classified areas of the building. Over 100 news organizations have credentials to cover news within the Pentagon, a freedom which has been enjoyed in one form or another since the 1940s. As a response to the new policy, nearly every single outlet with Pentagon press credentials handed over their badges, opting not to accept the new policy. Responding to the new rules, the Pentagon Press Association stated, quote, "The policy conveys an unprecedented message of intimidation to everyone within the DoD, warning against any unapproved interactions with the press and even suggesting it's criminal to speak without express permission, which plainly it is not." The first news organization which opted to accept these new rules is the One American News Network. OAN has traditionally been an extremely questionable outlet with a low factuality rating, high level of bias, and has historically promoted a long list of conspiracy theories. Furthermore, despite its claim that it receives viewership between 150,000 to 500,000, Nielsen Media Research estimated it to be around 14,000. We're just a disheveled band of degenerates, and we can say with full confidence that we're more qualified to report on Pentagon matters. The other two major outlets were the Federalist and the Epoch Times. The rest appeared to be freelancers from foreign organizations, as well as independent journalists who publish their work on social media. The entire situation gets much funnier when we remember that Defense Secretary Hegseth was the guy who leaked classified information about impending US airstrikes in Yemen by talking about it in a group chat containing the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. The second Trump administration has historically had a very combative relationship with the press and media organizations. In February this year, President Trump himself personally barred reporters from the Associated Press from White House briefings. The ban came after the president signed a law to federally rename the Denali Mountain to Mount McKinley and the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. The Associated Press reasoned that the Mount McKinley change should be adopted, as its name is a domestic matter. However, its official style guide recommended writers use the name Gulf of Mexico, stating that international viewers wouldn't be able to intuit Gulf of America. Despite condemnation from the entire White House press pool, Associated Press reporters are still excluded from attending presidential briefings. Fast forward to April, and the Trump administration would roll back rules which protected journalists from testifying in probes targeting leakers and whistleblowers. Commenting in an internal memo, Attorney General Pam Bondi would explain the change in her own words, quote, "Federal government employees intentionally leaking sensitive information to the media undermines the ability of the Department of Justice to uphold the rule of law, protect civil rights, and keep America safe. This conduct is illegal and wrong, and it must stop." President of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press had a very different perspective, stating, quote, "Some of the most consequential reporting in US history, from Watergate to warrantless wiretapping after 9/11, was and continues to be made possible because reporters have been able to protect the identities of confidential sources and uncover and report stories that matter to people across the political spectrum." Later on in July, President Trump would also file a $10 billion lawsuit against the Wall Street Journal and media mogul Rupert Murdoch.
Billions and billions and billions and billions and...
The lawsuit came just one day after the paper published a story about the president's ties to Jeffrey Epstein. The story notably contained a personal letter from the president to Mr. Epstein, which read, quote, "A pal is a wonderful thing. Happy birthday, and may every day be another wonderful secret." Commenting on the lawsuit shortly after its filing, the president would post, quote, "The lawsuit is filed not only on behalf of your favorite president, me, but also in order to continue standing up for all Americans who will no longer tolerate the abusive wrongdoings of the fake news media. Rupert Murdoch is quite famously the owner of a number of Trump-friendly outlets, including Sky News Australia and Fox News. The Wall Street Journal has since asked the judge to dismiss the case, however no decision has yet been made. Perhaps the most famous case was September's suspension of late-night talk show host Jimmy Kimmel, following a monologue about the death of political commentator Charlie Kirk. Although the suspension was a decision made by the ABC and Disney, as well as broadcasting station owners Nexstar and Sinclair, critics believe it was done to appease the Trump administration and prevent retaliation. The suspension came just hours after the FCC chairman, Brendan Carr, stated in an interview that the government would potentially pull broadcast licenses if Kimmel wasn't reprimanded. It would be an understatement to say that President Trump and the ABC have had an unfavorable relationship, as only last year, ABC News agreed to pay $15 million to settle a defamation suit. The lawsuit victory for the president came after the network incorrectly stated that he was found civilly liable for rape, when he was instead found civilly liable for sexual abuse. Jimmy Kimmel was later reinstated after a wave of public backlash. However, both Nexstar and Sinclair chose not to air the program. As much as we would like to remain as unbiased as we can, we've always had a pretty clear stance when it comes to the importance of free press and the functioning of democratic systems. We've called out the same sorts of declines in Belarus, Hungary, Turkey, Russia, Serbia, Australia, Vietnam, Mexico, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, just to name a few. Despite journalistic standards seemingly being eroded by click-driven business models, good journalists still provide a vital public service. Even from the perspective of President Trump's biggest supporters, setting a precedent that allows any government to silence, impede, or legally threaten journalists should terrify anyone who enjoys any semblance of basic freedom. There's been an unmistakable decline in American press freedom since President Trump's second term in office, and we'd be doing a serious disservice to our viewership if we didn't call it out for what it is. Absolute fucking bullshit. Late October saw the nation of Ireland go to the polls to elect a new president. Unlike many other nations, the President of Ireland has a largely ceremonial role, being primarily responsible for cultural activities and representing the country. However, they do technically need to sign bills into law and are the Commander-in-Chief of the Irish Defence Forces. The election was held on the 24th of October, though the lead-up began over the summer. The presidency of Ireland is a 7-year term, which can be renewed a maximum of one time. Current President Michael D. Higgins was first elected in 2011 and re-elected in 2018. Higgins won re-election with an outright majority against 5 other candidates and was the top choice of candidate in every single constituency in the country. The guy was pretty damn popular. With the attention on this year's race, it's probably a good time to talk about how a person qualifies to be nominated for the Irish presidency. In order to run for president, a candidate must at least be 35 years old, a citizen of Ireland, and be nominated through one of 3 methods. First, a previous president who has not served a second term may nominate themselves. Second, a candidate may be nominated by receiving support from at least 20 of the 234 sitting members of Irish Parliament, called the Oireachtas. The last way is by receiving the support of at least 4 of the 31 local authorities. Nominations opened on the 5th of September and closed on the 24th of the same month. Currently, only 3 parties in the Oireachtas hold 20 or more seats, those being Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and Sinn Féin. After an internal party discussion and debate, the 67 members of the Fianna Fáil nominated Jim Gavin as their candidate. Gavin is a former Gaelic football coach and ex-officer in the Irish Air Corps. Fine Gael initially planned to nominate former European Commissioner Mariad McGuinness. However, she dropped out on medical advice. Instead, the 55 members of the Fine Gael nominated Heather Humphreys, the previous party deputy and a member of Irish Parliament. Sinn Féin decided to not nominate their own candidate, but instead support an independent candidate with the backing of other leftist parties who lacked enough seats to nominate their own. Together, Sinn Féin, along with Labour, the Social Democrats, and several other minor parties and independent members combined for 79 people nominating Catherine Connolly. Catherine Connolly is notably not related to Jennifer Connolly. Seen here in the 1991 2021 film Career Opportunities, Riding a Horse. We really are doing our best to make the Irish presidential election interesting. Viewers may be aware that MMA fighter Conor McGregor also sought the presidency. McGregor expressed interest as far back as 2023, but really put himself forward on St. Patrick's Day in 2025 while visiting the White House. He proclaimed that Ireland was on the cusp of losing its Irishness due to an illegal immigration racket. His comments were widely condemned in Ireland due to a combination of their content and the fact that many have found them inappropriate on St. Patrick's Day. Initial polls from McGregor's original announcement revealed that as much as 89% of the Irish public would not vote for him should he be on the ballot. McGregor appeared to make little effort to actually get on the ballot, being reported to have not reached out to anyone as of August. Reception from the nominators was equally as cold, with one poll finding that nobody in the Oireachtas was willing to nominate him, and another finding that out of 949 members of a local council, just one responded and said that they were willing to consider him. He did eventually reach out to councils for a hearing, but ultimately withdrew on the day that he was meant to meet them. Early polls showed Connolly with a lead in the race, but still relatively open. On the 3rd of October, however, a former tenant of Gareth Sheridan publicly accused him of wrongly keeping €3,300 as a result of a rent overpayment in 2009. The tenant attempted to contact Gavin to recoup the money, worth about $4,500 today, but Gavin allegedly never did. In the fallout of the story, Gavin chose to suspend his campaign. Viewers would be forgiven for thinking that $4,500 15 years ago is a relatively small story to stop a campaign for, and you would probably be right. However, housing in Ireland is currently one of the highest priority issues. Despite Gavin's withdrawal, he couldn't be removed from the ballot, as the deadline to withdrawal was the same day as the deadline for nominations. Connolly was also under pressure to drop for a while, as she represented banks in house repossession cases in court in 2013. She was defended by the Bar Association of Ireland, however, who noted that lawyers should not be identified with their clients, lest criminal offence attorneys all quit for fear of defending murderers. Connolly's later work during her time in government showed a much more critical stance on banks, and she ultimately didn't drop out. Among a wave of candidates dropping out or failing to score a nomination, discontent with the process grew, with a number of people believing that the process of being nominated for president was outdated and anti-democratic. Some felt as if it was preventing outsiders or those with views against the current government from having a chance to make their own case to the people. In response to this sentiment was a movement for people to spoil their vote, or to mark it in a way that can't be read. Unlike other nations, Ireland officially tracks and reports spoiled votes, meaning these dummy votes essentially make up their own voting bloc. The election took place on the 24th of October, with the results announced the next morning. The election was a landslide victory for Connolly, at 63% of the vote, while Humphreys took 29.5%. In quite spectacular fashion, spoiled votes still got around half as many votes as Humphreys, tallying over 213,000. Connolly's 63% is the highest percentage ever earned by a candidate since the establishment of the position, winning all but one of the constituencies. Connolly has promised to be an inclusive president and to represent everyone. Of course, only time will tell how her presidency goes. We now cross over to Myanmar, where the civil war following the nation's 2021 military coup continues to ravage the country. The headlining incident this month took place on the 6th of October, when a government paraglider dropped bombs on a Chungyu crowd celebrating a Buddhist festival. 24 people were reported to have been killed in the incident, with one local stating that children were completely torn apart, and another commenting that they were still cleaning up body parts days after the attack. Viewers might remember Myanmar's military takeover 4 years ago, which was made famous when the coup convoy was filmed behind a woman's dance routine. The coup started following a general election in 2020, when the Union Solidarity and the Development Party, a proxy party for the military, got absolutely fucking stomped. Despite being the second most popular party in the election, the party won only 7 out of 224 seats. By comparison, the winner of the election, the National League for Democracy, took 138 seats and secured over 68% of the vote.
That's all I needed for him to do that, and it became personal with me.
Leadership within Myanmar's military didn't like this, because the nation's entire electoral system is basically designed to give the military a disproportionate amount of power. On top of its proxy party, 25% of all parliamentary seats are automatically reserved for unelected members of the military. The fact that the military got a 25% head start and still couldn't score half of the seats of the National League for Democracy pretty clearly demonstrates its lack of popularity. However, instead of trying to work on its policies to better appeal to the citizens of Myanmar, the military would instead take the country by force. And the nation has since been ruled by stupid hat-wearing fuckhead Myang Aung Hlaing. It's suspected that Myang Aung Hlaing took power as he was 5 months away from his 65th birthday, which is when the commander-in-chief of the nation's military is forced to retire. It was also suspected that Myang Aung Hlaing's exit from the military could open him up to potential prosecution for alleged war crimes. It's never a great sign when someone has to take power to avoid going to jail. What followed was a complete collapse of any semblance of the nation's already compromised democratic systems. Former ministers would be hit with bullshit charges in an attempt to legitimize military rule. Protesters would be jailed, and a campaign of media censorship would begin. Since the coup, the nation has become a shell of its former self. Its economy is estimated to be 30% smaller than it would have been without the military takeover. Hyperinflation has ravaged its currency. 3.5 million people have been displaced, and the nation's public health system has effectively collapsed. This isn't even considering the effects of the ongoing civil war, as the military government wrestles control with a broad alliance of anti-government forces. As at the start of October, anti-government forces controlled 96 out of 330 townships across the country. In recent times, Myanmar's military government has had to increasingly rely on conscription to bolster its forces. In February 2024, a mandatory 2-year military service would be introduced for both men and women under the ages of 35 and 27 respectively. The announcement not only led to a huge wave of people fleeing the country or outright joining resistance groups, but also spurred a massive wave of corruption. Government officials quickly realized that people were usually willing to pay bribes to avoid military service.
So I'm gonna pay you $100 to fuck off.
This was made even easier under new laws that could punish relatives of citizens who evade the draft. The draft came after the military encountered difficulties finding new recruits. One recruiter talking with the BBC stated that they were only able to sign new members after threatening to burn down their houses. The government's campaign against opposition groups has been characterized by a long string of war crimes and civilian casualties. An estimated 6,000 civilians have been killed since the outset of the conflict, while an internal research group estimates that government airstrikes have destroyed 187 religious buildings, 114 schools, and 39 hospitals. Coming back to this month, and the major reason why the government's airstrike was carried out by a paraglider is because external sanctions have made it increasingly difficult for the government to maintain its military equipment. With that said, the government has been able to secure a recent influx of weapons courtesy of Russia, who in turn has been granted rights to extract oil and minerals from within Myanmar's conflict zones. Myanmar is scheduled to host its first general elections since the 2021 coup in December this year, but as you can imagine, it's mostly just for show. A bunch of opposition parties have already been banned. Press freedom is a joke, and voting is only expected to be available in the parts of the country under military control. Myanmar currently stands as yet another example of how the ambitions of a handful of morally bankrupt people can cause absolute misery for millions more. Since it was so popular last year, we've once again decided to cover all the 2025 Nobel Prize winners. As a small disclaimer, usually each story we publish is first heavily edited by Swag, which is designed to fact-check content, minimize bias, expand on key areas, and ideally make the stories more interesting. In this instance, however, when Tim the writer, who is an actual engineer, handed in this script, we came into a slight problem. Swag quickly realized that his crowning scientific achievement of getting a B- in Year 10 Applied Science made him entirely incapable of understanding what the fuck any of this means. With this in mind, the script remains nearly entirely unchanged. If the content gets a little dry, feel free to skip ahead, but if not, Swag hopes you enjoy it. Every year, 6 prizes are awarded in physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, literature, peace, and economics. Technically, the prize in economics isn't an original Nobel Prize, being established in 1968 by the Swedish bank, although it has all the same benefits as the other 5. Winners each get a gold medal with an image of Nobel, a diploma, prize money of 11 million Swedish krona, about 1.03 million USD, per prize, and a colossal ego boost. Each prize may be awarded up to 3 living people, although it can be awarded to organizations larger than 3 people, and will still be awarded if the winner dies between the announcement and formal awarding. Winners attend a banquet in Stockholm on the 10th of December, the anniversary of Nobel's death in 1896. With all the prizes for this year announced, let's go over the winners. The Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded equally to John Clark, Michael H. Devereux, and John M. Martinez for their discovery of macroscopic quantum mechanical tunneling and energy quantization in an electrical circuit. For the viewers who aren't world-class quantum physicists, let's break it down. Quantum tunneling is a phenomenon where particles appear to phase through solid barriers like they're using the no-clip cheat. Imagine you throw a ball at a wall, but instead of the ball bouncing off or leaving a hole, it just disappears and reappears on the other side like Harry Potter at platform 9 3/4. In normal electronics, electrons move when they are free to flow through the material, with each having a unique set of characteristics. In superconductors, 2 individual electrons can pair up, called Cooper pairs. These pairs are special because 2 separate pairs can be identical, allowing them to be described by the same equation. The winners set up an experiment where 2 separate portions of superconducting material were separated by a thin link of insulating material, which usually blocks the flow of electrons. In the experiment, the initial flow of electrons was 0, as expected. As time went on, however, electrons would periodically tunnel through the barrier and flow on the other side, showing that despite the barrier, the Cooper pairs in the 2 superconductors can be effectively treated as a single large item. Further, the energy of the electrons that tunneled through the barrier was found to be in distinct bands, or quanta, proving that the observed effect was a result of quantum physics. Quantum physics is famously complicated, so this is a simplification to the best of our understanding. A true rigorous explanation would involve hours upon hours of theory and complex math that, quite frankly, none of us are even remotely qualified to talk about. But what does this discovery mean for you? Quantum effects usually occur on the microscopic scale, but as the prize description might suggest, this new effect proves that it can apply to macroscopic events as well, such as a measurable electric voltage in this case, because all the electrons can effectively be treated as one unit. It can be thought of as an artificial atom, with massive potential applications in developing a quantum computer, or to simulate atomic-scale events on an even more observable level. The Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded equally to Susumu Kitagawa, Richard Robson, and Omar M. Yagi for the development of metal-organic frameworks. Metal-organic frameworks, or MOFs for short, are highly porous structures, with an extremely high surface area and a vast number of cavities for a comparatively small amount of material. As little as a single gram of material can have the surface area of an entire American football field. This huge amount of empty space can be used to capture smaller molecules and confine them to an area, as if each was given its own hotel to stay in. Robson discovered this phenomenon by chance while preparing for a chemistry lesson. He noticed that because atoms only form certain shapes when bonding, specific combinations could be exploited to form crystals with large spaces between the groups of atoms. These structures proved quite fragile, but Kitagawa and Yagi showed that more sturdy builds were possible. Further, the 3 each showed that the precise size and chemical proportions could be tailored so that the MOF will attract and capture specific molecules. In one example, an MOF was used overnight to harvest water from the air of the Southwest American desert, producing drinkable water when the sun warmed it up the next morning. Because each MOF can hold thousands of molecules, it has been likened to the famous bag of holding from fantasy games. MOFs can be used in a number of applications, such as filtering out forever chemicals from water, reclaiming valuable minerals from mining waste, and safe storage of hydrogen. Theoretically, almost any molecule can be captured by an MOF, as long as it's tailored correctly. The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded equally to Mary E. Bruckner, Fred Ramsell, and Simon Sakaguchi 4. Their discoveries concerning peripheral immune response. The immune system is the body's army, constantly defending against invading bacteria, germs, and diseased cells. But how does the immune system know what cells should be killed or left alone? Initially, it was believed that this process was regulated through something called central immune tolerance, where as white blood cells mature, they learn how to better identify friendly cells as they age. As it turns out, however, it's not quite that simple. One of the major cell types of the immune system is the T cell, divided into two major types. Helper T cells patrol the body, looking out for infections and reporting them when they're found. Killer T cells go around and attack identified cells, such as those infected with viruses or tumors. All T cells have a set of special proteins on their surface that they can use to scan cells to identify them. For example, a virus-infected cell will display fragments of the virus on its surface, which a passing T cell would recognize, triggering an attack. Initially, each T cell uses a random combination of genes to create these proteins. As many as 10 to the power of 15, 10 quadrillion combinations are possible. The sheer number of combinations means that invaders can always be identified, but it is also inevitable that some will trigger against healthy cells. T cells mature in an organ called the thymus, where they are tested, and cells that have proteins attacking the body are eliminated, creating the central tolerance from before. An experiment showed that if this organ is removed in mice, the immune system would go into overdrive and lead to a plethora of autoimmune diseases for the mice. Interestingly, however, it was also found that immune cells from mice with the organ intact could be injected to the sick mice and calm the immune system. This finding proved that not only does the thymus screen out cells that attack the body, but there must also be another method to explain why the mice's immune systems calmed down. Researchers theorized that there was some form of suppressor cell that hunted down T cells that escaped the thymus test and prevented them from attacking the body. Ultimately, some researchers drew some ambitious conclusions and falsified some data to back it up. After it emerged, some evidence was false. Researchers largely abandoned the suppressor cell theory. Not everyone, however. After several years of researching, Sakaguchi discovered a third type of T cell, distinct from the helper and killer cells from before. Regulatory T cells, as they are called, are distinct due to a characteristic signature all T cells express. All helper T cells express a protein known as CD4, while killer T cells express CD8. Regulatory T cells express both CD4 and another protein, CD25. Because they express CD4, they were previously dismissed as helper T cells and largely ignored. Researchers were skeptical of the discovery due to the previous fuckery and requested more data before accepting the discovery. Enter Brucknow and Ramsell. All the way back in 1940, Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the US was conducting tests with mice, when some of the male mice unexpectedly came down with a previously unknown disorder, suffering scaly skin and enlarged lymph nodes and spleen, dying within a few weeks of birth. About half of the male mice were affected, but females were fine. Because of this, it was realized that the disorder must be from a mutation on the X chromosome, as male mice only have one, while females would have two. Males with the mutation would get sick and die, while females would be fine as they have a copy without the mutation. Fast forward to the 90s, Brucknow and Ramsell decided to investigate the issue, sequencing an identified region of the X chromosome, an enormous task for the time. After some searching, they narrowed down the possible cause to 20 unique genes, carefully trying them one at a time until they got the answer. On the 20th try, they finally got their answer, a gene known as FOXP3. In their investigation, they began to suspect a similar gene in human DNA might be responsible for a similar autoimmune disease in humans called IPEX. After collecting samples from humans with IPEX, they discovered that humans with IPEX did indeed have mutations of their FOXP3 gene. 2 years after this, Sakaguchi, and others soon after, convincingly proved that FOXP3 controls the development of the regulatory T cells. These regulatory cells also patrol the body like helper cells, but instead oversee killer T cells. And if they spot a T cell that slipped through the screening and is attacking the body, it can order the T cell to cancel the attack, sparing the healthy cell. The Nobel Prize in Literature was awarded to Laszlo Krasznahorkai for his compelling and visionary oeuvre that, in the midst of apocalyptic terror, reaffirms the power of art. The Hungarian author is noted for his philosophical writing and the ability to create intense anticipation in the reader. He reflects a European history of absurdism and grotesque excess in writing, but crucially, also makes use of East Asian inspiration and mythology. Much of his work is inspired by the social tension and unrest during his youth and time living in socialist Hungary, and the upheaval during its dissolution. The Nobel Prize for Peace was awarded to Maria Corina Machado for her tireless work promoting democratic rights for the people of Venezuela and for her struggle to achieve a just and peaceful transition from dictatorship to democracy. Machado has been seen as a key figure in maintaining unity in Venezuela and ensuring the flame of democracy burning amidst a growing darkness. She was also chosen for her work to push democracy against a backdrop of growing authoritarianism around the world. Keen-eyed viewers will note that this person is not Trump, who famously talked many times over the past year about how he should win the Peace Prize, saying he should have won it 4 or 5 times by now. Leaders around the world have also expressed that they might support his winning under various conditions. Zelensky said he would support him if he gave Ukraine Tomahawk missiles. Putin said he was supportive of Trump, and Netanyahu allegedly handed him an envelope containing his nomination after the first stages of the Israel-Palestine ceasefire were activated. There are a few things to note, however. First, nominations for this year's award closed on the 31st of January, less than 2 weeks after Trump took office, and well before any of his peacemaking efforts began. Second, being nominated actually means very little. Anyone can be nominated for nearly anything. Theoretically, we, the Swag News team, could have been nominated for our courageous efforts to mix shitposts with cutting global news. The committee simply sifts out these nominations before making a shortlist to analyze more in depth. Further, nominations and their reasons for nominations are kept secret for 50 years, meaning we won't know until 2075 at the earliest if Trump was actually nominated. Third, the Nobel Committee likes to emphasize their independence, so Trump's very public campaigning and gathering of support may have actually hurt more than helped. The committee would have wanted to emphasize their separation from public pressure. Despite this, however, should his brokered ceasefires stick, he will probably be legitimately considered for the prize next year. Only time will tell. The final prize, the Economics Prize in memory of Alfred Nobel, was awarded jointly to Joel Mokyr, Felipe Aghion, and Peter Howitt. Mokyr received half the prize himself, while Aghion and Howitt received a quarter each. Mokyr won for having identified the prerequisites for sustained growth through technological process, while Aghion and Howitt won for the theory of sustained growth through creative destruction. Historically, economic growth has largely continued on a regular up-down trend, regardless of whatever technological or scientific discoveries occurred. Starting in the 1800s, however, this began to change, with growth being consistently up since then, increasing at an average of 1.5% per year in Sweden and the UK. Mokyr proposed that the idea of useful knowledge, a combination of practical knowledge, such as that a skilled carpenter might have, with propositional knowledge, that which a scientist who just made a cutting-edge discovery might have. When the two are combined into useful knowledge, it leads to the development and improvements in processes, driving growth. According to Mokyr, a major factor in why this is only happening now is a larger willingness to accept change. Aghion and Howitt noticed that while economic growth has been stable, under the surface, the source has been anything but. In the US, approximately 10% of businesses go bankrupt every year, with as many new businesses opening. This trend continues in jobs. As a business improves, it increases an incentive for other businesses to try and improve, lest they become part of the 10%. The winners noted that the benefit of research for companies may be limited, as eventually someone will come up with something new. Generally, however, the benefit is far larger as the research builds on the old, meaning that the new value could not be found without the old first. Thus, subsidizing research and growth is important, as it encourages companies to take on the risky objective of investing in research. They also noted that as growth increases, the creation and destruction of jobs also increases. increases, potentially leading to higher unemployment. In order to make it easier to let people find the jobs that truly fit them, there must be strong social safety to permit people to take risks and seek jobs that may disappear in future. Otherwise, people will stick with the safe jobs out of necessity, hamstringing growth. This concludes the Nobel Prizes for 2025. More comprehensive information about the winners and their discoveries can be found on our list of sources in the description. Should any of the 14 winners be watching this video, congratulations on your achievement. And if 11 million Swedish krona is suddenly burning a hole in your bank account, our Patreon is linked below. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has now been going for 3 years and 8 months, and the war on the ground is very different from what it once was. Around Pokrovsk, major Russian armored assaults have been halted, and estimates place losses at around a third of all vehicles used. As we've covered in previous months, Russian commanders have shifted more towards infiltration tactics to break up the front lines. Although smaller groups have had much better success than larger assault forces, infiltrating Russians are operating in extremely perilous conditions. Cut off from being reinforced or resupplied, these smaller squads operating within Ukrainian territory are often hunted by some of Ukraine's best troops. Despite these insane risks, infiltration squads are currently seen as one of the only effective ways Russia has been able to break past the front lines and disrupt Ukrainian supply lines. Zooming out a bit, and the United States unveiled a new set of sanctions this month, targeting 2 of Russia's largest oil companies. Responding to the new sanctions, Russia's foreign ministry called them extremely counterproductive to the process of finding peace within Ukraine. Objectively, however, Russia bombing a kindergarten and killing 2 kids on the same day also didn't stretch the olive branch all that far. Russia's former president, Dmitry Medvedev, had a far more damning response to the new sanctions, stating, quote, "The US is our enemy, and their talkative peacemaker has now fully embarked on the warpath with Russia. The decisions taken are an act of war against Russia, and now Trump has fully aligned himself with loony Europe." Some analysts believe that the new round of sanctions will force Russia to further discount its oil to the nations still willing to buy it. With this in mind, even its largest buyers have been hesitant to take advantage of cheap Russian oil exports, fearing they could risk secondary sanctions from the US and EU. Major Chinese state-owned oil companies have already suspended purchases of Russian seaborne oil, and refiners within India are soon expected to drastically cut their own oil imports. October's sanctions are a part of a wider effort of Ukraine's allies to isolate Russia from international markets, in an attempt to cut off funding for its war effort. Speaking this month, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer stated that Putin was not serious about peace, which is why Ukraine's allies were planning to unlock billions to help finance Ukraine's defense. This is likely referring to the plan to use 140 billion euros worth of frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine's defense efforts. However, no concrete plan has been made as of yet. The proposal has been met with a myriad of legal challenges since first being proposed, and we have no timeline of when these might be resolved. Russia now sits in a very precarious position, where its entire economy is being propped up by the Ukrainian invasion. However, the very same invasion is killing off its younger generation, destroying its civilian economy, and slowly isolating it from the rest of the world's largest markets. Even under the very best circumstances for Russia, this war will leave it permanently damaged, and no amount of propaganda or shifting goalposts will bring back the hundreds of thousands lost in such a pointless war. The news is over, but we have a big fucking announcement to make. For nearly a year and a half, Swag and Krusty have been hard at work on an enormous side project. The video is something of a retrospective of the original Modern Warfare from 2007, but goes far beyond what's been done in the past. It goes over how the game gave birth to the modern shooter, the core team that would ultimately branch out and create nearly every headlining FPS today, and how the developers had to scrape and claw to even get the game approved. As a news team, we were also able to tap into our huge list of military contacts to see how realistic the game actually was. If there was a tank scene, we talked to a tanker. If there was an intelligence scene, we talked to an intelligence expert. That kind of thing. We even found an AC-130 sensor operator who wrote us an entire referenced breakdown of the gunship mission in-game. We also extensively analyzed the plot, because the civil war within Russia and a conflict in the Middle East aged exceptionally well, all things considered. The video is an absolute labor labor of love, and it's the longest,
That's what she said.
most expensive thing we've made to date. It's due to go live exactly a week from now, and we're insanely excited to finally show it to everyone. Of course, neither it nor the news would be possible without our amazing Patreon supporters, who have carried us more than they'll ever realize. If you'd like to support what we do and get your name in the end credits, a link to do so will be down below. Until next time, on behalf of the entire team, we'd like to wish everyone a very happy November.